Welcome back. I hope you were well. It's a pleasure to have you join again. I am going to be speaking on the topic failure to lunch. And today's topic, failure to lunch, is a part two of a conversation I began in the earlier session I did yesterday, which was titled Boys to Men. In that session, I talked about the transition that is necessary for boys to move from boyhood to manhood. And I explained that it's as thin as a razor's edge. But most young men, especially in the West, do not have the ability, do not have the motivation, do not have the way, the path of making that leap from boys to men. Chronologically speaking, they are adults. Emotionally and mentally, they are still boys. And one of the reasons is because they refuse to wean themselves away from mother's milk, mother's breasts. A metaphorical statement, but one that presents a vivid picture in your mind. The wildebeest has a few hours from when it's come into this world to get its legs strong enough to run with the wild, to run with the pack. Why? Because the lions, the predators, are on their way. Survival necessitates that transition. It wants to nurse, and mother says, no, this is the wrong time. It's not safe. Get those legs ready. They're too weak. Mother pushes the baby away. Why? Mother does what is against her instincts for the survival of the little baby. Now, in the West, particularly in parts of the Anglosphere, what we find is we've gone past the whole bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Survival, we are safe. Security, generally safe. Our physiological needs have been met. We've moved to the point of self-actualization, or self-esteem, to be more precise. And therefore, we've lost sense of the importance of growing up. So what we have is a lot of young men still behaving like boys. Chronologically speaking, they should be men, emotionally and mentally. They are still boys. And one of the reasons for this is we raised a generation of softer men and harder women. Now, to understand that statement, I have to go back to the turn of the 20th century. I talk about the various generations that we have had over the many years. The silent generation, the great generation, the silent generation, baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z. And just to make sure I have that reference correctly, let me give you an idea of how this has come about. I won't spend much time because I've covered this in other sessions. 1901 or 1900 to 1920, we had the first generation. These were the generations that fought and saw the first, I apologize, 1900 to 1927, they saw the First World War. The generation that followed, we call the silent generation, was from 1928 all the way to 1944. Now, I have to make sure that I get this right. I know the dates, but I conflate the great and the silent generation. So let me make sure I'm getting the chronology correctly. Let's see. Yeah, so the Great Generation, I think I was correct. Apologies if I wasn't. The Great Generation was from 1900 till 1927. From 1927 to 1944, we had what we call the silent generation. The baby boomers followed the silent generation, 1944 to about 1960, 67. Generation X followed from 1965, 67, all the way up to depending on where you are in the West, 1980, 1982. The millennials followed Generation X from roughly 1985, 86, all the way to 1999. And then you had what we call Generation, or the I generation. The characteristics of the first generation, silent and great and silent, were very similar. They were very similar. Character-wise, men of those two generations were very similar. Now, I'm going to say something that perhaps, depending on what generation you come from, may be too hard to take. However, this is not just an opinion. This is backed by data, statistics, and facts. You see, facts are very stubborn things. They don't necessarily care much about how you feel. They have integrity, which is why we call numbers characters, and we call letters characters. They have integrity. They hold their weight. Numbers do not lie. They're quite rigid. You may not like what I share, but if you look up the data, you will find this to be correct. The great and the silent generation sacrificed everything for their offsprings. I hold the baby boom generation primarily, my father's generation. And I don't say this from a place of a happy place, but I hold my father's generation, the baby boom generation, for most of the social ills that we see today, both amongst men and amongst women. These were the generations that tossed away all of the characteristics that their fathers and forefathers had. They felt that they were more intelligent because they were certainly more intelligent educationally, but they were not wiser. They did not have good judgment. But they tossed it aside all of the great things that the two generations prior had transferred as inheritances. They felt that they had seen enough wars and they wanted peace. It was all about love, feelings, self-esteem. And what we have seen is that they produced, and we have seen the third generation of people who have come from that mindset. The baby boom produced the Generation X, my generation, who very selfish, very focused on self, all about me, who then produced Generation Y, and it continues. Men in today's day and age who unfortunately live in the West, who fall within Generation X. As a matter of fact, perhaps I would say Generation Y, moving forward, have this issue about failure to launch. You see a glimpse of that in Generation X, but not as much. But you see much of it in Generation Y, Millennials, Generation Z, and onwards. The failure to launch, primarily because as a result of certain ideologies. I cover this in other sessions. I will not go into them in this session. We created a generation and more of softer men and harder women. Now I talk about some of the failures. In the session I did yesterday, I talked about the 3 S's. How boys keep score: sports, success, and sex. I also talk about how men keep score: the 4 P's: provision, protection, presence or professing his love, and the priestly duties. And I juxtaposed both of them, and I said, what you tend to find is that as boys move into manhood, both chronologically and emotionally, there should be a holding on to some of the things from the past, such as sports, and a merging of the things that are required, such as the responsibilities, duty, obligation, honor, and sacrifice, as opposed to the focus on happiness and personal gratification. That's one of the hallmarks of that transition. It's more about group interest as opposed to personal interest. Now, one of the things and one of the ways, and here I am going to talk about some clues to recognize that you're still in that boy phase, irrespective of your chronological age. You're still there. But one of the things I will share as clues is, and this goes back to how these boys were raised. Some of these boys were raised in two-parent families, some were raised in single-parent families, and some were raised with no parents. Now, irrespective of which of the groups, there is a consistency, a common theme about men who still have that boyhood installation software. Number one, you live close to your parents. Now, at the first instance, that might seem a bit too harsh, but let me expand. If you care much about the survival of a child, the one thing a good parent does is anticipate their absence during much of the life of the child. So at the early stages, a father, a mother tries to give you so much. It's a combination of love and discipline, focus, self-identity, a vision, and delayed gratification. But the most important part is they have to put you in an environment that is sometimes unlike home, which is a safe place. Home is where you can come back to and have mother's homemade cookies. It should be a place of peace. But the world is not mother's kitchen. The world is a hard place. It's a difficult place. So as a parent, what we try to do, or what you parents try to do, should have made a correction, is simulate, whilst within the safety net of the home, so you simulate what will be the natural environment. Because unlike the wildebeest, you are not in the natural environment, one with nature. We have the protections. But you have to simulate the natural environment so that the child understands and develops the emotional empathy and is complete as a human being emotionally, but also understands how to survive. Survival is the first gift the father gives to a child. And this is why you need both parents, one providing that survival instinct and the other nurturing, so that you have a well-balanced child. Young men who live close to home, and here is the qualification, who failed to go out to the world and be amongst the world, and in their first instance, run back home to be within close proximity to parents, that is an indication that you're still in the boyhood software. One of the reasons for this is because they want to be as close as possible to the two people who love them the most. They want to be as close as possible to mama's milk. They can't wean themselves away from mama's breasts. So they may go to college, far from home, but as soon as they graduate, they run straight back to be close to mum and dad. Why? They cannot and have not been trained on how to survive far from mother and dad. Now, I know growing up, and most people who are professionals will tell you this, ideation and individuality or individualization are two important components of that transition from, should I use the word, a mother's son to becoming a man. We start with the family, we take on the ideas, the temperament, you might even call it the personality of our parents and our siblings. But at some point in your life, there should be a separation where you start to identify what makes you different to both your siblings and your parents. This is where you start to join groups. You pledge. If you're a lady, perhaps you start forming a small club. If you're a guy, you join sports. You join an educational club. You're looking for a way to show that you are different. Most men who have the failure to lunge cannot be away from that safe space, partly because they have been conditioned They have been conditioned to be dependent on their parents. Now, number two, one of the reasons why those men come back is because they have become best friends with their fathers and mothers. Now, I don't have an issue with having a great relationship with your father. I think you should. And I don't have an issue with having a great relationship with your mother. I think it's necessary. I do have a problem with you having no friends other than mom and dad. This would be the same as two couples who have no friends other than each other. So he cannot go out and be a man. He is only a man within the confines of his wife. She cannot go out and be a lady. She's only a lady within the arms of her husband or her spouse. These are people who have not learned how to socialize. Now, men who fail to lunge have not been properly socialized. If you place them as children amongst other boys, you find they hide in the corner. They feel intimidated because they operate from the emotional side of their personality. Again, I go back to the point I made. They have been conditioned to act like women. A generation of softer men and harder women. Now, these are the same men who run most of their logic through their emotions. Now, you will find when you converse with such men, they like to live like Peter Pan. It's all about play. It's all about the infinite pleasure, happiness, satisfaction. They complain and they gripe about things rather than take problems on as opportunities to solve difficult issues, find solutions, and grow. You also find that the men in this same group tend to have more female friends than male friends. Now, most people might think, well, that's a bit of a reach. Why would you make such a reference? I make such a reference because it is important. You tend to find these men have few male friends, masculine boys, masculine friends. They never actually got into rough and tumble play. I'm going to talk about this shortly. They never were part of either a sport where they played some form of group sport, part of a team, understood how to work with other men. They never really participated in individual sport either. They may have participated in some sports, but it was the soft sports. They may be very great in academics because they could have been recluse in their approach. These are people who love video games, not always, but they do love video games. They love playing instruments because it's all a solo experience. They may have loved anything that kept you within the safe space of the home. Mum and dad are downstairs, you're up in your bedroom, playing the band, playing the piano, playing your video games, studying, but you're not in the playground, wrestling in the mud with other boys. You're not pushing those boundaries. You're not learning how to be a man. You're not separating yourself from the rest of the family. Now, these men, over time, without question, go through mood swings. Depression, negative mood swings, unhappiness, either with their jobs, with their lives, with where they are. There's almost an absence of a sense of purpose. That's partly because father never instilled in them the identity of what it means to be a man and the responsibility of manhood. Now, I talked in yesterday's session about the razor's edge separation between boyhood and manhood. And I say that thin line, as thin as a razor's edge, is the word purpose. The idea of having a purpose, understanding your purpose, having a purpose-driven life, having a responsibility or obligation to something greater than yourself. That is what separates you and moves you from where you are to where you should be. Now, let me talk about the question, why? As you may have listened so far, you might be thinking, well, perhaps this is not their fault. In yesterday's session, I talked about the importance of understanding that someone else may have been responsible for making you who you are up until the age of reason. From the age of reason, you have the ability to separate right from wrong, understand good and bad. You can think inductively, you can think deductively. Therefore, you are now responsible for the life you live. And I'll say this just in case I forget. If you've paid once already, you never have to pay twice. All right, let me rephrase that. If you paid once already, there is no need to pay twice. If you found that, if you did an audit on your life, you find that the tendencies that I have described about boyhood represent the life you lead or live, you've paid already. It simply means that any day you can pick up a piece of paper and say, I am going to transition from where I am to where I want to get to. But let me talk about the why. You know, why the boys stay stuck. Why is there a failure to launch? Yes, your parents are responsible for installing the software in you. You are responsible for uninstalling and reinstalling the software. Now, I think it was Alvin Toffler who said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. I usually conflate Alvin Toffler with someone else, but I think that he was the one who said that. You have to learn how to learn. You have to learn how to unlearn. You have to learn how to relearn. A wise person, Andrew Carnegie said, an educated person is not one who has any unique or specialized knowledge. An educated person is not one with the abundance of specialized knowledge. An educated person is one who has developed the faculties of their mind such that they can achieve whatever they want without harming, obstructing, or influencing the ability of others to do the same. Now, this simply means that no one is educated. We are always learning, we are always developing. But that transition from boyhood to manhood, therefore, is very, very important. But there's a reason why, and let me speak to the reason why, because at the core, I talk about how you have clues to know that you're one of these people. You cannot live separately from the proximity of father and mother. The reason partly is because of what is called helicopter parenting. Parents who just cannot let go, for whatever reason. There's a self-satisfying need to have the children close by, to have the children dependent on them. Sometimes it's partly because of how they were raised, and perhaps a decision not to raise their kids in the manner that they were raised. Some other times it's actually for self-interest reasons. The desire to be needed, to be wanted. These are the same parents who throw a tantrum whenever the kids do something different to how they would or would have wanted. But it's funny, you give people just enough, parents give their children just enough for them to just make it through a week, a month, but not enough for them to last and decide and make decisions for themselves for a lifetime. So the children keep coming back. They have to come back because there is no one else that they can go to, and they haven't been taught how to, they haven't been socialized in such a manner that they can interact with the rest of the world. These are people who cannot recognize or separate good and bad people. So they have to go back to mum because that's the avatar they have of safety. Now, you find two-parent families as such. You also find single-parent families as such. Within two-parent families, it's a funny dilemma. The son becomes almost a surrogate husband next to the main husband. The boy becomes a friend to the father because he cannot go out and make friends, or he will not go out and make friends, or he's been conditioned to be so much next to his missus or his wife or his spouse that it just feels natural to keep it within the family. Now, for single-parent families, particularly, boys raised by mothers, what you see is something different. We see a concept called son husbands. The mothers have raised their sons to be like husbands, men that they can depend on, but men that they haven't trained such or to an extent that the men can walk away and go begin their own lives. What you also find is whether it's a two-parent family or single-parent family, the boys in question were denied, for whatever reason, omission, commission, of roughhousing and rough play. I was having a conversation with someone over the weekend, and I was explaining how important it is to roughhouse, how important it is to play with kids, particularly at a younger age, so that they can understand their boundaries, strength, they can understand how to understand the game of life, play the game of life properly, so that they always have people around them to play or to play with. Boys that do not go through roughhousing, rough and tumble play, tend to be son husbands, tend to be boys who do not know how to become men and stay within proximity of mother's breasts. Boys who were not given boundary enforcement, who were not taught about delayed gratification, boys who were overshadowed with love, without understanding that you need a mix. Love is like a hammer to the person with a nail. Everything might seem, that a hammer will solve that problem. Love is important, but there are other things that men need to move from boyhood to manhood. Discipline, focus, structure, boundary enforcement, delayed gratification, and fathers who did not or were not available to provide all of that. Sadly, the consequence is that the boys in question never form, never develop completely as men or as boys, let alone men. And therefore they struggle with things in society. These are people who do not understand societal laws and norms. Now, I talked about in 2 sessions ago the charge given by David to his son, Solomon, specifically. Be strong, show yourself a man. Obey the laws, obey the precepts, obey the norms, obey the commandments. And if you do so, you will find success. But David had been around to show his sons how to be leaders. Boys who do not have fathers around, or who had fathers around, but who were feminine men. They may have taken the boys to a local sports center. They may have enrolled them in various sports. They may have had them in the best, learning under the best teachers with regards to musical instruments. They may have done everything. They may have provided the resources, but they did not play with these boys themselves. These boys were not part of a group, whether that be martial arts, whether that be rugby. Therefore, these boys never really developed to understand their uniqueness, their strength. They were not socialized properly. Now, over the weekend, I was traveling with my beloved, and we drove past an outdoor rugby pitch. And as we slowed down, I looked into the rugby pitch, and here were these young men. They must have been perhaps 23 and below. Some of them looked much younger, say 14 and 15. These were big strapping fellas. You could see the biceps and you could see the calves, playing rugby in the open air, and I was delighted. Why? Because these days we don't have boys playing. We've created this protection amongst boys that we don't want them to get injured. We want to reduce their testosterone, their aggression, so much so that we've feminized a lot of these men. I was delighted to see young men, strapping, good-looking young boys, having fun amongst each other, bumping into each other, maintaining the rules of the game so that they could play the next day, but having a great time. Boys who did not experience that. Now, football is a great game because it's great in building relationship. But for a man, you have to go beyond something like football, because football can also be very soft, depending on how you play. It has to be something more physical, which is why the rough and tumble play comes in. Hunting, martial arts, boxing, any form of martial arts, grappling, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, karate, taekwondo, You're being taught carefully about a tradition, a way of life. You're being guided under someone else's guidance, but you have people around you. And as you succeed, you're promoted. And as you're promoted, you're recognized and celebrated. And you go from white belt and you keep transitioning. Same for rugby. You start up not knowing how to hold the ball. You're taught how to hold the ball. You're taught how to tackle. You're taught all the various steps. So what you tend to find is sons that unfortunately did not have any form of boundary reinforcement or boundary enforcement, either at home, nor play with father, physical play with father, or spend very little time around other men. Now let me segue. I hate to bring in my personal experience, but let me segue because I think this is important. When I was growing up, my brothers and I always, as a group, joined my father whenever he was going down to meet his friends. When he was going for drinks, we would be there with him. So from a very young age, we were around men. You know, if you've heard the saying, be seen but not heard. You know, I had years and years and years of that. So imagine you are in a pub and you have a table and there are a table of 4 or 5 men having a great time, having their drinks, and then you, the boy, the son, is in the corner. Now, when we walked in with my father, always, he introduced us to all of the men. There's something important about this conversation. He introduced us to every single man. You went up to them and you shook their hands. And the men called on to you to come and shake their hands. They looked you in the eye and they sometimes they repeated your name. Sometimes they asked you how you were. In many ways, he was teaching us that we are just as important as those men. Now, he would ask us to sit in the corner and we would be quiet, be seen, but not heard. One of the great lessons was, as I sat there, I saw men converse about everything: politics, social issues, personal issues, familial issues. But here was the key thing. I saw men in the art of thoughtful disagreement. Emotions put aside. And when the emotions got high, I saw men intelligently work through their disagreement. I saw men talk about any and everything. I started to learn that men come in all shapes and sizes. And sometimes the biggest in the group was not the wisest, was not the smartest. Sometimes a soft-spoken person was the one with good judgment. But what was useful was being around men and starting to see other men that did not have the same personality traits or mannerisms as my father. It did something. It made me understand that I did not have to be like my father, despite loving my father and seeing him as a great man. It was a way for me to prepare for the world. Learn how to converse, how to disagree. I have been in locations, in meetings with my father doing business, and I have seen my father maintain his moral compass and say, I will not do this. I have seen men go into business with my father, refuse to pay my father, and my father had no malice. He maintained his composure. He still greeted those men whenever he saw them publicly. And I have been in several occasions, 4 or 5 years down the line, the men came back and apologized, returned what was supposed to be my father's share with interest. And I saw different things, just being around men. Now, the reason I say this is I make reference to, in some of my sessions, the importance of sports, rough and tumble play, and martial arts, fighting. Rough and tumble play is a part of sports. Martial arts is a part of sports. When I talked about the 3 S's, sports, sex, and success, sports is very important for a number of reasons. It teaches you how to succeed in life. I'm going to give you a good example, perhaps a segue. Dancing is another useful one. Partner dancing. Great for understanding relationships, but also great in knowing how to have a good relationship and work with someone. It's a sexual thing. It's also a relational thing. You learn how to, the nuances, unspoken and spoken, of being with someone else. Sport is similar, but it's more about protection and nurturing and preserving. You learn your strengths, you learn the strengths of other people. As a young man, I was learning by being around other older men, manhood, and how to be a man. I was not just simply, I learned from my father, and that was great. The character I have today comes from my father. The value system comes from my father's beliefs. But I was being allowed the opportunity to see, hear the views of other people that were not consistent with my father's. And so I never reacted from a place of emotion. I still do not. At the start of this session, I talked about boys who run their logic through their emotions, who behave like women, who are too feminine in their disposition. This is partly because these boys were not actually socialized properly. It's important to understand that if you fall within this category, all hope is not lost. The question is just, how do you transition and how do you move from where you are to where you want to be? I should also perhaps, as I conclude today's session, talk about something that I think is important. Let's assume you disregard everything I've said, but let's also assume you fall within the group. There is a consequence for not making that transition. My experience has been you tend to find the men who have this issue about failure to lunch tend to have issues with alcohol. They tend to pick behaviors and mannerisms without showing constraint and without knowing how to restrain themselves. So they tend to drink a lot because sometimes they're running from their responsibility. They tend to choose women who are, as partners who are, whilst having a feminine hardware, have a very masculine software. In other words, because they are feminized men, they choose women who are masculine in their software installation. And these are men who, for example, will find it very natural whenever there is a threat to look to the woman for her to go and check and make sure that everything is safe. These are men who believe in the 50-50 approach when it comes to protection. In other words, let's go together. These are men who have not actually been raised to recognize that protection and provision should come as part of the manhood experience. They can provide, no doubt, because they can work. But when it comes to the instinct to protect and preserve, it doesn't come naturally. Why? Because they were allowed to behave like women most of their lives. You tend to find with these men, sometimes they tend to have more female friends than male friends. Why? Because women have empathy, have kindness, have love, and therefore they find that they are more comfortable around that softness than other boys who can tease and poke, perhaps sometimes even bully them. So these men have more female friends because they operate from the feminine frame rather than the masculine frame. How do you change? Well, I'll give you one important consideration. You need coaching. I don't necessarily think I'm the right person to tell you how you can make that shift. I will tell you this. Think about the body. If you do not use a muscle, it will atrophy. The best way to develop that masculine part of you is by practice, is by application, is by use. So you almost have to suppress the instinct that you already have and hold on to and try to reach for what you think you need or what you know you lack. It's almost a displacement approach. Number two, you need to be uncomfortable and you need to be grateful and happy being uncomfortable. And this might mean separating yourself from mother's milk, moving away from mother's, wean yourself away from mother's breasts. This is partly why at a young age we teach kids to go out, go hunt. I saw a video some time ago, a young boy, his first time catching a huge fish. Next to him was his sister, his mother, and his father. And at the moment he caught the fish, Dad and Mom stood back and just directed him on how to reel the fish in. Huge fish, as big as he was, young little boy. What I saw there was parents who knew how to step back and allow the child to go through that transition. That picture would never leave his mind. Why? He was still within the safety of father and mother, but he was allowed to go through the experience himself. That's your catch. That's your fish. So if you find that you are within this category of men who have failed to launch, you're going to have to move out of your comfort zone. See, if you're not willing to take a risk, you cannot grow. If you refuse to grow, you cannot be your best. If you do not attain or move towards or strive for your potentiality or your best, you can't be happy. If you are not happy, you will always have moments with depression. You will never have a happy life. The key starting point is take that risk. Start the separation process. Start looking for people, perhaps who have what you lack from a masculinity perspective, to support you. Now, I have found in interacting with several people, when you meet women who are too masculine, in the presence of women who are feminine, there's a calibration. The masculine women start to dress and behave like the feminine women. It's the same thing as in a work environment. The women dress without consideration for dresses, feminine styles. They dress more in jeans. If a feminine woman starts to work in the same office and dresses in a very feminine way, dresses, heels, makeup, just dressing like a lady, a classy lady, you start to find that the other masculine women, not because they're masculine in their disposition, but in how they dress, the lack of efforts. Boys just wear jeans and put on top and we're good to go. Those women will start to change. They'll start to wear more dresses. Similarly, a man or a boy who is too feminine in the presence of good men, but in a place where he feels comfortable, will start to pick on attributes of other men who are more masculine. I'll give you a good example in my case. Over the years, I have had a great opportunity of being around someone particular in mind. I wouldn't say their name. And they have a very, very happy disposition, positive, playful disposition. I find that in their presence, there's a softness about me. They embrace play, and I'm forced, when I visit them and when I'm with them, to relax, to just live a little bit and laugh and play and allow that inner child of me to come out, because they are always in that inner child state. And that's a compliment, by the way. The point I'm making is that by osmosis and by influence, we change. Now, a great person once said, always ask yourself a question: who am I around? What are they doing to me? And is that okay? Is that acceptable? The influence we get from people by association can be very subtle. It's important to understand whether those influences are in your best interest. So, in closing, son, it's time to grow up. And you start that process by acceptance. See things as they are. Decide on how you want and wish that they should be. And get moving. Find yourself a coach. Find yourself a few accountability partners. Go out and make friends. Get around other men. You have to get good at almost pursuing, trying to find new boyfriends if you are a man. Go find boys, go find men who perhaps can complement you in a way that you need so that you can achieve your long-term goals. Now, I hope that today's session has been useful.